call upon the Prime Minister to give a speech for 7 minutes. Oh, wait, hold on 2 seconds.
Alright, hold on.
You need to get set up there real quick? You good?
I'm good.
I've lost that.
And is it okay with everybody if I record the round, like, for just my benefit? I can delete it after if you don't like what you said. I can share with y'all.
We're doing like a selfie cam?
No, it's just voice.
Yeah, it's cool.
This angle, just doesn't do
Whenever you're ready.
Panel, the stakes have changed, make no mistake about it. We think climate change and the displacement of people it causes is nothing less than the new conquest by which we fight wars, although we're not fighting wars with bullets and guns, we're fighting them with smokestacks and with automobiles, right? We think that this is nothing less than the domination of land, and therefore, principally, the only way to recompense for the destruction and loss of land is to provide new land. What I'm going to talk about today is principally, after I model, is principally why we think that this is an ought motion and why this is specifically important that we talk about the principle, but then Cody's going to talk about the practical benefits as well. So let's get into that model. We think that, first of all, we think that substantially, the way we're going to do this is we're going to have an international commission of like the WHO, the WHO, and the UN who are going to get together, get their leading scientific experts, representational, one scientist from every country, all that good stuff, and we're going to decide who is responsible for climate change. We don't think this is that hard in terms of just like who contributes to global carbon emissions. Then we will take the top 5 countries off that list. If it changes, so be it, but we think those 5 countries are probably going to be like the US, China, UK, France, and Germany, and we're going to do this aggregated over time since the Industrial Revolution to now. We will then say whatever your proportional contribution to global CO2 emissions are, is how many people you have to be willing to take. So we will then take the people, we will offer to the people, that's key, offer to the people any land which has been lost, once again designated by that group of scientists, any land which has been lost to climate change because of like rising ocean levels, and we will say that, for example, if 100 people have been displaced from this land and the US is responsible for 60% of CO2 emissions, the US must accept at least, or be willing to accept at least 60 people of those 100. What we will do is that we will grant them, and this is important, sovereignty in their nation. We will give them a resource-rich region. We will give them job and language training if they want it. We will offer them citizenship as well. We also allow these people, because we value their humanity, to choose. We will say that you can choose to come to the United States if you wish, but even if you don't come to the and if you do come to the United States, we will pay for your way, pay for your training, pay for your assimilation, all that great stuff, and we'll offer you a ticket back if you would like a ticket back anytime in the next 40 years. And then sovereignty, we're going to give you a state, we're going to set it up, for example, we'll give them Colorado, because Denver was just voted the best place to live. Come to Colorado. We will give you all these things because we value that political and material enfranchisement. Do we have any questions on the model? I want to set up a good debate.
Are you giving them citizenship in the United States and citizenship of this micronation?
That country would offer citizenship, yes, both in the United States if they wished it, but also in their own sovereign nation as well. Okay, so let me talk about why land is the only just restitution. First, why land, and second, why these nations. We think that the principle of commensurability is that if something is taken from you, the best restitution is to get that thing back. At the point where we cannot drain the oceans and get you your land back, we say that the next best thing is to give you land and political enfranchisement as that which is closest to your loss. Like, this is intuitive, right? If Cody takes my shoe, which Cody often does for whatever reason, and I'm asking for something back, we think that the best thing he can give me is my shoe, not some money to buy a new shoe. No, I want that shoe. And at the point where Cody destroyed that shoe by throwing it under the ocean, the next best thing he can get me is a shoe that looks a lot like it. So what we say is that at the point that you as a country are responsible, that 60% mark, for example, for the climate change, for the weapon that overtook a country like Bangladesh, we say that you owe the people of Bangladesh the closest thing to that which they lost. Now, why specifically these nations? We say that these nations, the one I listed, have infrastructure that was most directly built on the climate change that conquered the rising tide in Bangladesh, right? We look to the case that the US and the UK combined are responsible for 60% of the global greenhouse emissions since the Industrial Revolution. We say that the US has therefore benefited most greatly off that which is destroying it. So there's a directness principle, right? That if you are directly responsible for the harm caused to somebody, you ought to also be directly responsible for the restitution to them. The best we can do is to evaluate that directness based on this proportionality measure. Next, capability. We say that this infrastructure that you have built, i.e. roads and commerce, which allows people to flow throughout the United States, which allows people to flow through, throughout France, which allows for France's killer healthcare system and education system, is actually largely built on the emissions which you use to destroy Bangladesh. At that point, or like any other coastal country, like Sierra Leone. So at that point, we say that because you have the capability, you also ought to do it. Question?
Okay, so I get that it'd be good for the people and you have the capability. So is that the only justification? Is this a moral justification as to why states would do this, or?
We say the moral justification is you hurt somebody, and you most directly hurt somebody, and you most directly can give them that back, which is closest to how they got hurt. Right? Next. Open space. We think that the countries that benefited most from these are or the countries that are most responsible for climate change are larger countries, like the US, like China. And like China, even if right now we're it's still developing, in 50 years we think it's also going to be a lot better. And we think that the fact that all of Bangladesh, geographically fits in Montana, means that these countries are actually best equipped in terms of land to actually deal with this. So yes, we get there's going to be political backlash, but what we say is that there's less political backlash when you're giving away part of a larger country rather than when you're giving away half of Luxembourg, for example. Also, and then finally, why political enfranchisement? We think that people have a right to self-determination, but that right to self-determination, because we are physical beings, is unfortunately tied to your physical circumstances and what you can do with the land on which you live. I.e., you can't choose to live underwater. Sorry, we haven't invented that technology yet. So what we say is that now that you've been moved out of a place where you had autonomy, or given the choice to move out of a place where you have autonomy, the best way to preserve that autonomy, which was denied to you by climate change, is to restitute it in the form of political enfranchisement so you can make decisions. The country which is housing you will pay for you to get the government up and running. They'll pay for you to get the infrastructure up and running. They'll pay for your training. We think that a wrong has been done, and we must reconstitute, or rather repay for that wrong.
Thanks to the Prime Minister for those remarks, and I'll call upon the Leader of the Opposition.
Nick and I come into this round not just as advocates for the people who are displaced by the dangers and by the consequences of climate change, but we are also here to advocate for the people who would be essentially and realistically completely unable to develop if the government's plan got put in motion. And because we think that yes, their principled stance is idealistic and sort of admirable, we think that they need to engage with all of the totality of the harms that this plan would cause if it was implemented, as well as understand the sort of real mechanics of how it would be implemented and where specifically it would fail at implementation. So before I get on to how this uniquely places the burden of rehabilitation onto countries that have yet to develop, I'm going to do a brief bit of refutation. So first, when he talks about how countries must help people, well, what we would tell you is that in this world where countries that have greenhouse gas emissions must take in people who have been displaced by greenhouse gas emissions, we tell you that after the initial wave where after the initial wave of where like US, China, India have to take in people who've been displaced, we would tell you that now when like Zimbabwe wants to develop, like industrialize, they're unable to do so because the costs incurred by industrialization and by using the cheap, dirty fuel that poor countries are reliant on would cause them to have an absolutely astronomical expense in terms of their long-term efficacy. Furthermore, though, even if you just take it at like the consideration of the countries that they're talking about, like India, like China, like America, we would tell you that a lot of times the infrastructure doesn't exist to effectively support these people after they've been resettled. Take, for instance, India, right? With 1 billion people, they don't actually have the resources to actually be able to resettle people necessarily and ensure that they have a quality of life that's either at parity with their previous life or better than. And so in that case, we would tell you that if they can't resettle them into a better life, or at least an equal life, it's not actually an action that benefits them at all. Finally, though, we would tell you again, this isn't actually a replacement, right? Like, yes, another shoe that looks really, really similar to the shoe that's at the bottom of the ocean is like, it's pretty close, but it's never actually going to be there. And at the point when you say that now that we've given them this many acres of land, now all of our guilt is absolved and we have no more responsibility to these people, and we have no more responsibility for the harms that our ongoing like economic development incurs on the rest of the world, we would tell you that you've created a masking effect and you no longer will be able to have discussion of the plight of those individuals in terms of the future of your country. Yes.
1, the fact that we're calculating global carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution says Zimbabwe has a long way to go before it eclipses the US. 2, on India, we just think that India is better equipped to deal with this than Bangladesh.
Yes, so dealing with this idea that, okay, the US and all the other biggest polluters of the world will be the ones to take the most of the burden. We tell you that's an incredibly short-sighted understanding of all of the consequences of your plan. Yes, in the initial wave of like rehabilitation, we might see China, US, India, all of the other biggest polluters take in displaced individuals. Nick will actually tell you why that might be a bad thing. But 20 years down the line, right, it means that if the government works, then the nations that have been historically the biggest polluters have now divested all of their energy infrastructure from dirty fuel, right? Like that's literally what the government side should be advocating for. And at that point, we would tell you that they're no longer going to be like actually taking in refugees from these countries that have been displaced. What that means is that any countries that continue to rely on cheap fuel and cheap means of industrialization will be forced to bear all of the costs of the environmental destruction that like Western and rich countries have imposed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Yes, they take a proportional stance on terms of like, this is the amount of carbon that you guys have put into the atmosphere as of this moment in time. However, we would tell you that that destruction of the environment caused by these countries is never going to actually make like total recompense for all of the citizens of the world. And at that point, when you're then after the initial wave of resettlements, placing the entirety of the burden of industrialization and the consequences of dirty fuel onto poorest nations who are trying to industrialize and trying to develop, then we would tell you you're not actually going to either A, get the best efficacy because they're the countries least equipped to deal with it, but furthermore, we would tell you that this is absolutely, like, principally unfair for one thing and non-supportable. So why is it principally not something that Nick and I would support? Well, we would tell you that America got to industrialize and then, in the government world, they paid the cost, right? What is important and essential to understand is that in the government world, you can't have the coexistence of development through industrial means, and destruction of your environment, destruction of your natural resources, as well as simultaneously be resettling potentially millions of people into your country at the same time, especially when you're going to be continuing in that train of industrial development for the very long future as far as we're concerned, and therefore you're going to continue to have to bear the costs of this policy even past the point that you can actually continue to deal with it. So we would tell you that you have to understand that this doesn't actually create an equitable solution in terms of a proportion of carbon emissions into the environment to the amount of people that you would actually be resettling. Because the countries that have already industrialized, the countries that have used cheap fuel and cheap resources and essentially like destroyed their environment in order to develop, have already done that, and now they're the ones who are financially able to bear the costs of all of these refugees. Sorry. And so we would tell you that on the gov, like in the gov world, they would turn that on its head. That rather than countries having to bear the costs of their industrialization after they have industrialized, and after they can bear that cost, after the initial wave, they would have countries bear the cost of industrialization at the very moment that they are trying to have an economic development. And we would tell you that that, one, means that you'll never have the best economic development for those countries, which we would tell you is appalling, but two, it means that you'll never actually get the best efficacy for these people who have been displaced. Look at like historical precedent for when people have been moved from one location to another, and how lots of times that's very, very atrocious in its implementation, particularly within the lens of a government operation. So Nick and I bring you the idea that this policy creates unimaginable harms in the long run for countries that have yet to develop, because they have the burdens of industrialization placed upon them when they're most weak, rather than the countries like America, India, China, who have placed upon it when they're strong.
Thanks, Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Honorable Speaker and esteemed panel, I'm going to give you a separate principled line of analysis about how, what kind of High School Musical style, we're all in this together, we should share that burden collectively, even if it hurts us in the short term. More people living in the long term is probably a good thing, especially morally speaking. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how uniquely we think that sovereignty is important, and that part of the model was a little bit under addressed. But first, like a lot of outstanding points for rebuttal. So the only principled line of argumentation that we get out of side opposition is to say that there should be equity in these types of policies. Well, I would surmise that India is their best example, and that a preponderance of the evidence by the scientific committee might realize that since the Industrial Revolution, most of India's pollution may have actually been caused by British imperialism, say India Railways throughout like the late 1800s through the 1900s. So I don't understand why they think that it's going to be a completely unequitable thing at the point at which we identify the top 5 polluters and say it's actually uniquely their responsibility. And through a preponderance of the evidence, we can probably figure out who those people are. Like, the only other thing that we have to say is they don't say that we ought not do this. They just have a problem with how we do this, right? So at that point, we think that first government wins the model, wins the motion. And I think maybe it's smart for them to hide the principal argument in the DLO, but it's probably unfair for us to only be able to respond in a 15-second POI. So anytime we hear another principle out of side opposition, whichever bench it is, whenever they're going to something that's other than a consequentialist framework, which is what first opposition argues, we'll stand because that's the only opportunity that we have to provide a response. Okay, we don't care if it causes minor harms to developed nations, like completely ignore the top 5 polluters that we're talking about, which are all extensively developed, and the fact that we're aggregating this from the Industrial Revolution, and the fact that Cam tells you that these nations are going to stay way out ahead of developing nations. Like concrete is something that China is producing every single day. It's actually the most polluting material to build, right? So we think that they're probably going to aggregate and keep adding on to their already gigantic contribution. Therefore, places like Zimbabwe have an immense roof to get up to where they'd be taking the brunt of these people. And at the point at which this motion happens, we're taking all the people who have been substantially displaced at this point and we're moving them into those top 5 countries. The policy continuing into the future has a much less just population burden to deal with if you really, really want to justify this on a consequential level. Then, they say that there's a masking effect, right? And this will prevent us from thinking about either development or from people who are affected by climate change in the future. We say no. I mean, you're interacting with people who lost their livelihoods and their lives and their homes to climate change on a daily basis, even if they're just living next door to you. Like, maybe we should give them Montana, since that entire side of the bench is from there, but, but maybe not. I don't know if Montana's really all that great or not. Somebody from over there can tell you. The basic thing is we're going to give them the infrastructure, right? A good, well-positioned place so that they're not just like living in, I don't know, like Texas or somewhere that nobody really wants and is undesirable, even though Texas is actually resource-rich, has a lot of oil. It might be a good example. I'm not really sure. Ultimately, we think that that's what this debate comes down to, is a deontological reason as to why they should not do this, and there's no deontology on their side of the house. Again, they're not saying we ought not do this, they just have problems with how it looks on our side of the house, and we say, at that point, you're just ceding the debate to us. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the other principle that we want to talk about. So I think the question that we need to answer on our side of the house that's left unsaid after Cam's speech, which he answered a lot of questions, is to say, how does creating new states for these displaced people reshape global politics in the 21st century? We think this is just a principled argument that underlies giving these people new states. It's that High School Musical, we're all in this together, climate change affects all of us type of attitude that these developed nations are actually taking on. We like that because what does it represent? Ultimately, we think it represents the ultimate act of international cosmopolitanism and indeed like small L international liberalism. That is the recognition of shared interests between actors in order to shape the future of international relations. Because this is all about how to achieve lasting peace and prosperity in the face of a problem that affects us all equally, right? Like if we don't have an environment, you can't live, and therefore you will probably die. So at the point at which we get all these consequentialist analysis out of first opposition saying there will be some harms, we'll just eat those harms and say that every single person who's displaced of climate change having to A, figure it out on their own, or B, die because of it is a much worse consequence, and we're willing to say that the short-term consequences are just far outweighed by that. So.
Okay, so Cody, your idea is to give them all a state. Now my question is, does that mean that the people of the Maldives and the Seychelles and Bangladesh all get their own individual states, or are they all just in one big state conglomerate?
I don't understand why it couldn't be the first part, right? Like we can figure out who's from where and make new Bangladesh in like a cool place in the United States as well as, you know, new Sierra Leone. We don't really care, and ultimately we think that the state thing, right, the reason that we want to give people sovereignty is for two reasons. One, it's not only an inherent recognition of everyone's stake in climate change, and like the reparation of those who have like contributed most to climate change to those who have been hurt most by climate change. We think that that's probably the biggest principled reason, and it's one that we're winning out of first government at the point where Cam stops speaking. But then secondly, we think it also consequentially incentivizes healthy development for nations that are not affected, right? Because it's not mutually exclusive with like forwarding policies in places like India and China to more sustainably develop as time goes on. We think that that's probably a pretty good thing, and they will be incentivized to do that insofar as they're trying to avoid the harms that first opposition is talking about, i.e. they'll try to move away from fossil fuel and resource-based economies so that they don't have to take on a burden in the future. We think that's good for everyone because it reduces everyone's overall contribution to climate change, and that will make it so that there's less people who are being displaced. So that's a big consequentialist line that we think we're also winning. But there's two other reasons why sovereignty is uniquely important. We would say it grants people the most important keys to A, political legitimacy, and B, material solvency. So let's talk about political legitimacy. We think that it gives the peoples who are being robbed of their sovereignty, who are being robbed of their political legitimacy by the environment that they're living in, the environment that developed nations created, a new way to have autonomy, right? And that's what Cam basically is talking about when he says it's your ability to continue to wield power independent of international actors, despite the fact that those international actors had formally taken that away from you in their contribution to climate change. So that's the first way that we're just allowing people a path to political legitimacy, another principled reason to vote for side government. But then secondly, a consequentialist reason to vote for side government is that we're allowing them to have material solvency. When Cam gets up here and says we're going to give you a resource-rich location that is going to be able to sustain you into the future, what we're saying is that you will have capacity, the other part of political legitimacy and material solvency, which is the ability to wield power and to carry out the basic tasks of policy, like social security, like providing a police force and sanitation. Those are the types of basic things that we take for granted when we think about state making and states existing, but those are things that are nonetheless very important to people's continued material solvency. Those are the reasons why we are proud to propose. For the three principal reasons that we gave you about commensurability, High School Musical, we're all in this together, and the access to political legitimacy and material solvency, we're very proud to propose. Thanks.
My next Deputy Prime Minister, I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Government side has two burdens and they have to meet both of them. They have to justify this on a principled level. They've made a lot of analysis towards that. What me and Jake would tell you is this fails rather dramatically at the practical level, which at the point where they don't justify both of them well enough, and we get more harms on this side, it is not worth doing. We can recognize that principally the United States probably does have some sort of obligation to the Middle East, right? But the idea that them acting on that principle, and if their action causes more harms than it does good, it is not worth doing. It is something that is a principle that should be unacted on. This is something that me and Jake really believe. We think a lot of that is why we can just go and do practical arguments of why this harms the people in these countries that we're talking about. But first, I think it's very ridiculous that you get to say that under our model, any sort of, like, we get to blame India's pollution on colonialist powers, right? Because, right, this would necessarily mean that all of the, like, developing and developed world get to tie their principal, pollution, something they've gained advantage from, to a few different countries, right? Canada's pollution is now the responsibility of the United Kingdom for like the first 200 years of its existence, right? We think this skews any sort of material benefits that you want on some sort of redistributive level. Secondly, we tell you if you're talking about the idea, the problem with your model is you didn't make it proportional to population, right? And insofar as you didn't do that, you're going to fracture political unification movements inside of the world, right? Because countries won't want to be in this top 5 floor that you've created, in which you have to actually create a refugee scenario, right? House refugees. We can see that this would stop things like European unification, right, or Korean unification, all sorts of countries that would now have to be acceptable and have to take refugee status. We can already see that Europe hates taking refugees. I'm going to do a lot of analysis on that later, but we think this ends unity. We think that's problematic. Secondly, they say that developing countries will be able to afford this green tech. No, they won't, right? Look at the status quo of green tech, how it's incredibly expensive, and only the rich countries that are able to massively subsidize it, like Germany, are able to actually get this kind of benefit. What you're doing is stalling the countries that can't afford it, the large countries that will then be in this top 5 and have to take this burden. We think that's really, really terrible. We think every country has a right to development. Okay. Later. I've got a lot of stuff. Okay, first point of new matter, this is probably pretty hard for your side. The idea of micronations, right? Micronations inside of a country necessarily have less bargaining power when you're talking about relations to the larger country that they're in charge of. Look at the relation between Swaziland and South Africa, right? The fact that South Africa gets to abuse smaller micronations like Swaziland because of their large thing. We think you still exist in a political context in the United States. Now, on to their claim that it's going to be a really great land. We don't think you get to fiat perfect implementation. We think you have to go through a political system that already exists, right? And insofar as you've looked towards the history of the entire redistribution of land, we think the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia has been really terrible at doing it. We think you're going to get resource-poor nations that are away from population centers, that don't have adequate developments that they want to talk about. We think that really, really harms them. We think ultimately high-power groups are able to continually take the people of the Maldives, put them in areas that they don't like, and then pass oppressive policies on them that restrict their ability to access movement and other things. Yeah?
Nothing's a perfect solution, but a micronation is better than dying underwater or starting a war because you're flooding into the surrounding areas. Also, if Britain was in charge of India at the time that it industrialized, we think that just based on international law, it's responsible for what happens in those borders.
Okay, but the second idea, right, fails your principle of they're benefiting from the infrastructure, right? The fact that you can't have it both ways. You can't have Britain built the railways, but now India isn't India gets to gain use of them, right? It's not a consumer at harm. It doesn't link perfectly, right? We say that that's kind of silly. Okay, so back to this idea of micronations, right? We think this ultimately creates a system where there's cultural destruction in really powerful ways, right? Look towards how you would have probably hundreds of thousands of people moved into a rural area that's poor, that's not going to get the adequate resources, right? What this then means, right, is that because you've granted them a mechanism of dual citizenship, people will choose to leave this poor, impoverished nation that's not culturally or economically probably similar in any way to the outside larger country, right? This means that you have first and second generations massively leaving this micronation that they've created, right? This means that you've created essentially new Americans, people that will culturally have American citizenship and then culturally identify with those people because they've actively chosen to. This means that we're adopting and culturally taking over the people of the Maldives, right, as opposed and putting them into an American lifestyle, which is the energy intensive, horrible lifestyle that is causing the global warming we're talking about. Okay. We also tell you that your model has a huge problem for developing nations, right? And okay. So first, the developing nations and the countries that are going to be in your top 5 global permitters in the next 50 years, 30 years, are going to be the countries that are also massively harmed by this global climate change, right? Look towards the example of Bangladesh, right? First thing, we would tell you that the majority of people aren't going to be in this formalized system, but are in fact going to have to leave because of economic plight in the very short term, right? We think this looks like Syrian refugees, right? But insofar as Syrian refugees, right, have to go from the country of Syria and disproportionately go to countries that are close around them, as opposed to countries that are offering the quota system, right, and in Europe. It means that we have the majority of Syrian refugees in countries like Turkey and Jordan, right? This necessarily means that the countries like Bangladesh go out to countries like India that are already further causing harm to their problem. We think if you look towards Bangladesh, that's 100 million Bangladeshis, along with a vast majority of eastern India, especially the Bengal region, that also suffers. We think this creates massive harms on their side. Well, we would tell you a much better alternative is to have natural forms of immigration, to loosen immigration, not based on carbon tax, but the ability to take care of these people and the ability to be close and form close cultural communities. We think that's already happens. What me and Jake tell you is that first, government might win on a principle level, but at the point where they fail very hard in the practical level, the policy is probably not worth doing, which is pretty good. Mark and Ryan probably disagree with the principle level. We'll let them do that. Cool. Bye.
Thanks to the Deputy of the Opposition for those remarks. Call upon the Member of Government to extend the case of the Government bench here.
Now, we think that what our opening half has done very well is show you that up until now, countries have acted in self-interest. We think both sides agree upon this. Now, we think that what we must show you, that the back of this debate should focus more on reducing this harm theory and focus more on the creation of global harmony and the reduction of this global warming in the long term. We think that's going to be the most beneficial. That is the practical we need to worry about. So now how are we going to do this? First, I'm going to give you some points of refutation, and then I'll move on to my point of extension, which is going to be the fact that we will allow for greater development of these countries. Now, first things we want to clarify, right, because we think there may have been some misunderstandings. Now, when we look at the top 3 polluters right now, right, China, India, US, okay, these are the top 3, and we think that it's unfair to take the assumption that all people are going to be passed on to countries like the UK. And we think that was a misunderstanding that we got out of the front half. Because most of the development that we have, although yes, it started to be industrialized by English colonialism, we've seen the majority of these carbon taxes, and especially China was relatively not colonized by England, right? And then we see that for India especially, we see that in countries like India, you have most of the development occur after the colonialization. And so the buck is still going to be there. I think that was a misunderstanding. We're going to move away from that. The harm is going to be on these countries that are producing it, like the US, like China, like India. I don't know the other top 2, I'm sorry for that. That's my lack of knowledge. But we're going to show you, at least in those cases, why fundamentally we're going to help global harmony, why this applies to other cases. Okay. Now let's go on to some refutation. Okay. First thing we talk about is micronations, right? That was a good point they brought up. They said they're going to have less bargaining power, but they failed to realize something that the Prime Minister said that was very important, is that these people will have the opportunity to gain citizenship in that country. Now, what does that mean? Is that when they tell you that there's no bargaining power in these nations, that it becomes sectarian, we tell you that no, that this citizenship will give them that political power. It gives them a political tie to the nations, and it gives them one with the other people. We think refugees are not a similar situation because refugees are not citizens, they are inherently outsiders in the system. They are not members of that social contract, they are someone that we are doing a favor to, right? When we give this citizenship power, what we say is that we have given to you, and now we have taken from you, and now we give back to you in this meaningful way. We have not just say we're going to give you some reparations, but we say we are now making you one of us if you choose to be. We're giving you the opportunity to have social cohesion. We think that's important. We don't think we're going to have the social harms that they want you to think. And the last thing they talk about is the equity and how it's not going to be equitably driven. We think that the clarification of the misunderstanding helps to mitigate that harm. Now, what are we going to talk to you for our extension, right? And we're going to tell you that the pure limitations in carbon emission currently are going to hinder development, and that hinders global harmony as a whole. Now, what does this mean? When we put in this axe, we spread the blame across both developed and developing nations, right? Any country that's going to be polluting is going to be the ones that are going to be taking in these people. What does this mean? Is we're having an equitable harm. This means that these people are contributing on the same level to the solution to the massive problem of the carbon emissions. We think that's going to help increase international respect when they're all paying the same burden, right? So let's go through some the link we have between these points. Before I go on,
will countries be paying the same burden? Can't a smaller country have a higher percentage of pollution, but it doesn't equate to the top 5?
Well, no, because it's not about percentage. Because what this is climate change, right? So it's about the impact you're going to have on the global community as a whole. And we think that's something that's important. If a country is polluting more just in pure number, you're going to have a larger impact on the world. It's not necessarily about individual population, because the people aren't the ones that are going to be giving up land. It's not the people themselves polluting, right? But it's the nation as a whole, the industries developed in that area. So it's not about the equity to each individual person, but it's about the country's entire development. It's about how that country as a whole has detracted from the international community, and how that country as a whole must now pay back to it. So that is why it's going to be equitable. So what we see currently with things like the Kyoto Conference, right, where we've seen that there's limitations in the carbon emissions on certain countries. What this does is developed countries which do need a lot of carbon emissions simply can't do them, and this hinders development. We see this with India, we see this with China, okay? Why is this going to be harmful? Is if India does want to develop, if China wants to keep using these carbon resources, which we have had the privilege of doing for so many years, they simply are either stopped by the Kyoto Conference, they want to abide by it, or they face severe political backlash where they are not abiding by this global treaty. Now we think this is harmful because it either increases global strife, or it decreases the ability for these countries to develop. Decreasing their development is going to keep them in the same process where they will never get green technology, or they'll never be able to actually be equitable on the national level. What does our policy do? Our policy allows for them to mitigate the harms they're doing to the international community for the short term, so that we can have long-term mitigation of global warming, of carbon emissions, and overall development of green technology. Now, how is this going to happen? When we allow for carbon emissions to occur, we let the countries continue the basic infrastructures and the basic industries that are allowing them to be profitable. While they can become profitable when they get extra money, that's how we start to see development. That's why we've started to see development in countries like India and China, which are becoming increasingly strong members of not just the manufacturing economy, but the developing economy as a whole, in terms of technological development, right? Now, what does this do? Additionally, we see that the large countries, including the United States, are heavily based on labor and agriculture jobs, right? So when these people do move from the places to the countries that have harmed them, well, we see that there's opportunities for development not just of reparations to those people, but also of beneficial to the economy as a whole, because we can't take up those jobs, we can increase the economy with these people. What does that mean in the short term? In the short term, we continue to harm the environment, and we do fight that harm. We continue the emissions of these countries. But what we also get is we allow for some economic development. We allow for these countries to gain an advantage that they have with the labor markets, and we allow them to continue to develop on the level. What does this let us do? This allows us to buy time, first of all, for them to develop new green technology, and second of all, to allow it to become cheaper, because we think that's something that's something that's important. If green technology is expensive, we agree. But it's becoming increasingly cheaper, and it's becoming increasingly more sophisticated. For example, we have Alteros, which is now like a blimp in the sky that can create tons of, that uses the wind power up in high altitudes to create much more energy than wind towers can. When we spend more time, we allow them to continue to develop, we allow green technology to develop until it's more affordable, more effective. What does this mean? It means that while these countries are still being able to develop, we are buying them time for green technology to come into place. Yes, America, yes, the developed world can now put in green technology. It's simply not feasible there at this time. Long term, what we do is we allow for equitable growth and equitable green technology to be put in place. We think we've shown that there's going to be respect in multiple nations because we are distributing this harm and the solution to these harms equally. We believe that we have the long-term solution where they only give you a short-term one. For those reasons, we urge a government ballot.
Thanks, and then the government, I call for the opposition.
honorable panel, I think that the government's hearts are in the right place, but insofar as the policy they choose to pursue and allow repercussions and recompense to those who have been affected by climate change, it is absolutely foolish and ultimately not only will put the literal lives of those people in jeopardy, but moreover, will put the grand type of international rhetoric about this being a worldwide problem, not a US problem, not a Chinese problem, into jeopardy, putting the entirety of how we conceptualize the way we solve climate change into jeopardy as well. I'm going to get on to my 2 points of new matter and tell you why we ought not place responsibilities on individual states dealing with the principal issues, and why we shouldn't use people as punishment for what they define as crimes. Before that, a little bit of old matter. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of commensurability that the opening government talks about. Like, one, understand that this is an individual principle, not in and of itself a state obligation. They never tell you why these states now just suddenly think that they're non-self-interested or that they have a responsibility or ability. States cannot and do not operate under responsibility or ability. They operate under their people and their people's best interests. Understand that this still principally exists. So even if you do get to fiat your way into claiming they give them Colorado, that does not necessarily mean they're going to do so in a particularly happy way, or that that's going to lead to good outcomes. We don't think that that ends up changing. Moreover, we think it's sort of dangerous when you guys categorize this as a literal loss of land. That isn't true. They are not losing just land, they are losing their state as a whole. You seek to recreate that state, recreate the cultural ties, in a place that does not have those, right? Micronations, or I guess Colorado if we're going with the original things, does not in and of itself have what it means to be Burmese, or what it means to be in Bangladeshi in that place. We think you remove them from that nation, not only do you incentivize their own nation to not care for them, but never to take them back. We think that is incredibly dangerous. We don't think this ensures autonomy. We think that this throws them like a fish out of water into a new place and expect them to have the exact same amount of rights in a way that is absolutely untrue. No, thank you. Then they talk about how the back government talks about how the real issue is solving the broader issue of climate change, and they talk about how this allows a spread of the blame. Except for that is literally in policy not what you're doing, right? You're not spreading the blame by enacting this policy. You are defining it as within these 5 countries are responsible for climate disaster. I'm going to tell you why that in and of itself is like a principle-less argument, but we think is incredibly dangerous. Then they talk about how this buys time and allows for green tech development. Understand that green tech development does not happen in emerging economies. It happens in Western nations, the very nations that we're talking about putting a massive burden to support new populations. We think this is particularly pernicious when it comes to how we see the recent Paris 12 Accord, where these countries are going to be funding green technology developments in other nations. We think this actually doesn't do that. We think that stymies that very development and ensures that the actual problem gets pushed down the line. No, thank you. All right, new matter. Okay, why ought we not ought not place responsibility on individual states? Understand that this action assesses blame, or this action is assigning blame and responsibility onto 5 sole nations, right? But in and of itself, it is not their fault in what happened. This was not an action of active colonialism. This was not an active choice that we were recognized of. The principle of harm and recompense requires knowingly harming someone. We did not understand climate change until the 1990s. And guess what happened at the point in which we started understanding the broader context of our actions? We started a massive movement to stop those actions. We did not knowingly do harm to these places. But also importantly to note that the US, Great Britain, and China are not alone in this. This was a human action, one of consumptionism, one of desiring the cheapest and most efficient fuel possible, regardless of its consequences. This is not something that, in terms of the principle of harm, is independent to these nations. Right? Ryden gets up here and tells you a very important thing where he says that some nations, like, I don't know, the Seychelles, which exclusively operate under coal power, like, have a much larger carbon footprint proportional to their population. This is not an issue of them being the West or them being rich, it's an issue of being human. And insofar as we think this is a human issue, it must be assigned human as the blame. Go ahead.
1, if I accidentally break your window, ought I pay for that window? And 2, why, or do you have a principled issue with the case, or do you just oppose the 5 nations versus 100 or 1,000?
I principally oppose the idea of assigning this as sole nations, because it's not true. It's a human issue. Secondly, we didn't break your window, everyone broke each other's windows. That's important to note. All nations have a responsibility. This changes the existential nature of the problem and defines it solely within the blame of 5 countries. The COP in Paris is a great example of this, where all nations, in the rhetorical nature of this, had a responsibility in changing this. We think that this hurts that very type of cooperation. Why? Because it assigns blame on 5 sole countries. This means that those countries, which were also the countries that were necessarily going to give lots of money to other nations in green tech development as a way to solve the broader issues of climate change, goes away because now they are seen as being unjustly attacked from it, but moreover, now they have a separate burden that they can A, point to and say we don't have any more burden, or either they just won't engage because of the injustice of the matter. We think this hurts the broader problem, we think that hurts the progress. Finally, why we shouldn't do this, use people as punishment for crimes. We think it does matter what happens. States are not, state or not, we think that you're ultimately going to be displacing the people who already live there in and of itself. We think this is particularly dangerous, right? We think that this A, fuels the racist rhetoric of people like Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen to engage and say, these people are sucking off of our resources, they are hurting us as a nation, they are not us, they are the other. We think this places them into specific dangers. There is a clear example of this. Look to the US's actions in Africa when trying to enforce gay rights, where they said, we will reduce your aid unless you support gay rights. Guess what happened? The countries pretended to support gay rights, and people who were actually gay in those countries started facing street harassment as being seen as those who were hurting our nation in and of itself. We think that when you take this reckless and untrue principle of harm and apply it to such few countries, you not only remove the rhetorical nature that is necessary for solving this problem, but you end up putting these people into forced martyrdom and put their lives literally on the line. Proud to oppose.
Thanks. Remember the opposition I called on the government.
An important thing to note at the beginning of this speech, Mr. Speaker, is that on closing government, we never believed that providing compensation in the form of land in another country was a sustainable form of providing these people the compensation for the harms that we did. Our case was that at the point where these harms have occurred, and externalities mean that these people have been displaced, this is the best course of action. What's our goal in the long term? It's not to continue providing this method for these people and for this solution to be something that's indefinite, but rather that the end goal is to end the processes which cause harm to these environments in the first place so that these people can live in their own homes. Our side was the one that acknowledged that there was a situation right now that was extremely bad and pernicious for those people who had been displaced. That the alternative wasn't going to be as good as their old life before their homes were destroyed, that it was going to be better than what they would have in their own nations, which was nothing. What am I going to do in my work speech? I'm going to talk about 3 points of clash. Number 1, the principle. Number 2, how we deter environmentally damaging processes in the future. And finally, about the lives of these people in the nations which they settle in. So first let's talk about the principle. There are going to be 3 principled subpoints under this. So first let's talk about commensurability. We think opening government did a pretty excellent job of telling you why commensurability as a principle is something which should be adhered to by individuals and as a general principle. The response we got from the previous speaker was that states inherently are different actors to people and therefore they don't have to act on that principle of commensurability. Our principled response to that point is twofold. Number 1, we tell you that there is a principled reason why states ought to shy away from a mentality in which they prioritize their own citizens over others. That's what Austin flagged in his introduction, that they shouldn't be selfish anymore. And that's the simple principle of a lottery of birth. that those states and the people who are fortunate enough to benefit from the economic activity and prosperousness of those states were arbitrarily born into those states. That the people who are losing their homes in countries which are being exploited by developed nations who are producing CO2 were arbitrarily born there and didn't choose to be exploited or to be born into a system that has been perpetuated over an extremely long amount of time. So we told you principally in response to that states ought to change their mode of calculus, the way that they think about prioritizing their own citizens over others. Therefore, we think that the principled analysis from the beginning about commensurability applies to states, and to the extent that states don't consider it now, it principally ought to. Second subpoint, intent. We think it was valid for the previous speaker to bring up intent, but we don't think that it stands at the end of this debate that externalities, simply because you didn't know about them, are not your fault. We think that was flagged in the POI, but that like the implications of this analysis are that if you are like a factory or a business or anyone who's conducting economic activity, and just because you don't know you're polluting someone's river or like being harmful to like farmers down the stream from you is like the classical example, that you're not responsible for that, right? We say that there's still a link in terms of you being culpable for that action and culpable for that harm. That link is simply that that harm would not have existed if you hadn't conducted those activities. So we say that regardless of whether you intended to harm those people, which we think is almost never the case in these kinds of scenarios, you do have a responsibility principally to help them. So the final point here is about human action, right? The principal point we heard here was that in terms of colonialization and economic development that pollutes the environment, it's not something that states did, it's something that's inherent to human nature. Two responses to tell you why that's wrong. Number one, we actually think that in a huge majority of cases, states actually conducted that behavior to make themselves more economically prosperous, right? But even in the case where you're talking about individuals who have no relation to like that state's infrastructure or aren't public officials or aren't doing it for the state inevitably benefits when someone in it has access to better economic means. So what does that mean? You as an individual may purchase like a car which like creates more CO2, talking about the colonialization, the era of colonialization, you as an individual may have conducted processes which were more harmful to the environment for yourself, but the state that you were living in directly benefited from your ability to use those processes, right, to gain the benefits of being more damaging to the environment. So we say that even to the extent that humans were doing it for their own good and not for any greater vision of state's prosperity, that the state was someone who benefited from that and therefore has a responsibility to deal with it. Yes?
But note that all people did that, and all states did that. Your principle assigns blame to only 5 states. That is untrue principally on the grounds that you described yourself.
So we understand that like there are many states which have done this, but we think that there's a huge distinction between like the top offenders and the bottom ones. And at the point where that's your argument, like we think that the POI actually stands. Like if your problem is with the number of people we have, as opposed to the fact that the states should be accepting them, we think that's a principled victory on our side. So let's talk about the second point of clash, which we think was important. How we deter environmentally damaging practices in the future. What was important about this point, it was to establish the nature of environmental practice and the nature of environmental displacement. The key thing to mention here, which has been implicit throughout the debate but never really stated, is that these kinds of activities take place on an absolutely massive timescale, right? So when opening opposition gets up here and tells you we're talking about things like the next 20 years, we say that's like not even close. We're talking about spans like 5 or 10 generations, potentially more. What are the kinds of activities that we think these countries do right now which are going to be changed? We think this is heavily intertwined with politics, which is what the speaker brought you before. We're going to give you political reasons in response to his analysis about why these countries will have an incentive to stop environmentally damaging processes. Reason number one, we say that states, like the top 5 states right now that would be ceding land, don't like the prospect of ceding resource-rich land. We don't think that's an attractive prospect for them. What do we think that does for those states and the incentive that puts on those states? We say that creates an incentive for them to adopt more green technology as fast as possible, right? To accelerate the rate at which they're converting from means which are environmentally damaging to means which utilize green technology, because they don't want to give up resource-rich land, and I will take you in just 5 seconds, to people who are moving to that country. Yes?
Why would Germany, a country that's not in the top 5, share its green tech secrets with countries that are in the top 5? Because they have no incentive to do so, because then they actually have to take on refugees.
So it's not about like green tech secrets and the best possible green tech that exists in the world. It's about the best possible green tech that you have access to. We think that all developed countries generally have a knowledge of what's environmentally sound, and even if it's not like the most optimal process, it's far better than environmentally damaging practices. That's not really a problem. So we think that it creates an incentive for you to stop those environmentally damaging processes. Moreover, we say that there's going to be huge political energy behind those kinds of movements. They're not just going to be from the top, because this involves people being displaced from those states, right? So if you're going to give Texas or wherever it is to other people, people in Texas are going to be angry that that is a prospect, that's something that's going to happen. That's why we think that generates political energy so that the claim I made before can actually be substantiated. We think that was important from closing. So finally, let's move on to the lives of people in the nations that they settle in. The line that I'm going to give you right now isn't a pleasant one, and we accept that at closing government. The lives that these people have in countries that they move into are probably not going to be as good as the lives that they had in their original countries before that land was destroyed or before they were displaced. But the comparison isn't to that land, right? It's to what they would be in their own country. So if you're displaced in a country that's historically poor, that doesn't have good economic infrastructure, the alternative is for you to literally be like a beggar and living in a slum. We say that at the point where they move to a developed country, they might face discrimination, but that's far better than the alternative, and that's why we think that we can justify that. But moreover, in the long term, the fact that this won't be happening is a justification that we support, we propose.
The next the government whip, and call upon the opposition whip to include opposition states in the proper period.
The bottom government starts their speech by explaining that this problem is not simply short-term or long-term, but this model solves for short-term solutions. But I would tell you that insofar as this short-term solution and short-term model rejects the idea of long-term change and possibly isn't even good for short-term change, we think that Mark and I win this round on a couple different levels. I have three crystallizing questions. How does this plan operate? What does this plan do to climate change? And what happens to the actors in this plan to summarize this round? So first, how does this plan operate? The top half of the debate was majorly a principle versus practical argument, one saying that we have the principle high ground, and the other saying we have the practical high ground. While Mark and I will tell you that we have both the principle and the practical, so it's an easy win for us on this side, we will tell you that the clash of principle versus practicality was lost by the government side in the top half. So, under principle came three things: commensurability, High School Musical, and political legitimacy, all which I think fail rather drastically. Now, I recognize that the top opposition did not directly clash with the commensurability, but Mark and I do. When Cody attempts to do abuse voters in his speech because he knows we're going to talk about this awful principle for a state actor, I think he knows what's going to happen. Being one, no, no, no. Like an ought actor, and an ought actor is both should and would based off of an individual direction. Right? We think that states ought, the actor being under this is state, would operate under how they should best treat their people, how they should best support their government. Therefore, your principle, logically, does not operate within a state system. We think that you fall under this, and that the actor should not or would not. Principally, we would reject this on an actor level. Secondly, the High School Musical one. So one, we tell you this model doesn't engage with this principle. When you tell us that we have to all be in this together and cast blame upon 5 countries, probably the richest, the ones that have done it in the most magnitude in the past, we think that it rejects the idea that worse atrocities are going on right now, and that mentalities have not shifted for a lot of these countries. So we tell you that this principle falls. Finally, political legitimacy. Like the top op completely destroys this when they talk about 1, practical harms. They have no real political legitimacy because 1, they're poor, 2, they're isolated, 3, they're unrespected in the global community. We don't think the sub-states or sovereign states within inside of bigger states have real political legitimacy. Secondly, we say this hurts developing nations, like under this discussion of either India has to have culpability or they don't, and we shift the blame upon other countries, right? We can't have it both ways, where we blame everyone, but then we only cast the responsibility onto one country. We don't think that principally the government side wins out on this. We think that we do in the long term. Secondly, what does this plan do to affect climate change? This is where Mark and I bring you as one part of our specific, our unique extension. We tell you that principally we reject placing blame upon individual nations, and this is where we reject the model and essentially the resolution as a whole and how it's been developed. We tell you that this is a global issue. They say that they can get past this because we're just sharing responsibility on the richer nations or the top 5 nations, which I assume are going to be these nations that can take the hit. We tell you that communal issues are far more important. And by casting a type of mentality upon this issue, as in we can cast blame and force the results and the responsibilities upon 5 individual nations, we think that we reject the principle that this is a human problem, not a global problem. I ask a POI, look at the percentage of certain countries which have much worse greenhouse gas emissions, how do they not share blame? And they said, well, because they haven't done enough yet. Okay, one, if you recognize that this is a long-term problem, then we have to have long-term solutions. If we have developing nations which can pollute as much as they want, and then in the future have some sort of threat that eventually we might have to give up some of our land, which probably won't be the best land. We're not going to give up Montana. That's awesome. There's a lot of awesome things to do there. We think that this is a problem, right? Allowing developing nations, or nations that are the most pernicious abusers of greenhouse gas and the emissions that affect them, to continue their abuse, we think rejects the idea that this is a global issue and would rather cast blame upon what I deem as the dirty five. Go ahead, Cody.
Okay, so are you advocating that we split these people up between all like 200 some odd nations in the world? Because that's kind of tensional with what you're saying in terms of political disenfranchisement and like spreading people up into smaller nations or into smaller pockets of other nations. So what's going on there?
Okay, so one, we would tell you that as the opposition, we don't have to provide the perfect alternative. We just have to tell you that that the plan provides more harms than the status quo. Two, we would tell you that having a global community want to place them would be a lot better than trying to isolate them as a state in the middle of Colorado or in the middle of the United States, right? If we have to displace a bunch of people with not the same culture, not the same religion, we haven't exactly treated our minorities very well, and we don't think that a small state in a country will do much better, right? So we would tell you that you say it's only that this is a short-term solution, but then say that it's a long-term issue. We tell you that this short-term solution isn't sufficient enough and rejects the long-term issue when countries won't stop what they're doing right now and we're placing blame upon not necessarily the wrong people, but not in the right way. Final crystallizing question. What happens to actors? And this is a couple different things. Green tech, individual, and state. So firstly, there's this argumentation around green tech, right? But we think that they don't understand or comprehend how green tech works. So we think that green tech will always be successful in richer countries that can provide that. We think that developing nations will not be able to exploit green tech technology because mostly they're dependent upon natural resources, right? They can't pull out a solar panel from the ground or mine a solar panel or a wind turbine into existence. So therefore, we don't think that developing nations are going to be incentivized to use green tech when they can only use natural resources. No, thank you. Secondly, individual. Mark tells you another part of our unique extension that one, the state would probably operate poorly and would be problematic for the individuals, but additionally, the people themselves are harmed. We don't think that using people as an access point is a good mechanism to solve change or to promote change. We think that using gay rights as a reason not to give people in a certain country food has been problematic in the long term and problematic in the short term, because not only does it not solve the problem, but additionally it causes a double harm to the people that are already most affected. The gay individuals now are also discriminated by their country, but also their fellow countrymen or country people, and we think that's additionally problematic. Finally, the state. We tell you that state operating becomes worse under this representation because they tell you that A, either they resent and reject the idea that people are going to be moving to their country, or B, that they will be able to handle it and not want to solve the issue. If your only responsibility is taking in more land or taking in a certain grouping of people, then we don't think that it gets to the heart of the issue or solves the issue in the long term. When we look at both principally and practically, Mark and I would tell you that principally this is a global issue, and practically placing blame upon individual countries is not good for the state or for the people that are affected by it.
Decision. The decision is the 1 going to the opening government, the 2 going to the closing opposition, the 3 going to the the opening opposition, and the 4 going to the closing government. So I'm going to begin with the 4 and work backward. So we thought the whip speech was excellent. We thought the whip speech crystallized the best arguments that came from the opening government. We thought that you engaged very well with the extension coming from the closing, the balance of culpability versus blameworthiness, and whether we're imposing kind of a strict liability-esque standard, or whether we're requiring there to be some sort of mental state or some sort of intent. That was handled really well. The reason you fall into the 4 is, to be quite honest, the extension was, none of us really were sure what the extension was. We gathered that you were attempting to make an argument about investments in green technology and how perhaps these countries are changing the way that they develop, but the whip failed to pull that extension through. So it's like in a very simple kind of role fulfillment problem that at the end of the day, it's almost as if you convinced us to vote for the opening government and convinced us that perhaps the opening government beats the arguments coming from the closing opposition. So for that, like, I think that your speech was excellent. I think that the whip speech wasn't lousy, but I do think that, like, the arguments themselves weren't very clear, and we weren't, just to be honest, like, we weren't sure what the extension was. So that's why you guys take the 4. So moving into the 3, we thought that the best material coming out of the opening opposition came at the second half of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition speech, in your discussion of micronations and the developing nations. The idea that when you have states within other states that have less bargaining power, e.g. Swaziland in South Africa, you run into huge power asymmetries that can generate massive political, cultural, and social problems. In addition, you talked about how there's going to be kind of like xenophobic rhetoric coming out of this stuff. We thought that the closing opposition really ran with that and added a lot more depth to it and filled in some of the links, and then on top of that added this like blameworthiness extension. So we were trying to figure out what to do with the Leader of the Opposition speech. The Leader of the Opposition speech was an excellent speech in mitigation, but I think that the criticisms that the government offered you in that there wasn't a lot of principled engagement, and the Prime Minister from the first 10 seconds of his speech challenged the opposition teams to engage the principle. Like, this is kind of a radical policy, and this is kind of a radical change in the way refugees are assigned. There's obviously going to be challenges, and it's like pretty easy to kind of model bash in an emotion like this. We think you did some pretty good model bashing, and we think that like you definitely called into question the efficacy of some of their policies. But at the end of the day, the Leader of the Opposition speech is kind of mitigation. Okay, so moving into the 2 and the 1. So we thought that the closing opposition team was kind of the first real challenge to the principle that comes out of the opening government, and that came in the member speech. So the member tells us that there needs, in order to force countries, coerce countries, or require countries to accept refugees, there needs to be an element of blameworthiness. And that a lot of the kind of infrastructure that produces greenhouse gas was created during a time, or was put into place during a time when people just frankly didn't know. So it isn't as if they were reckless, that they knew the risk and they did it anyways, or that they were negligent. Like this was a complete ignorance. So there's actually no blameworthiness that you can assign to these individuals. And that's kind of the debate we get going on in the back half. I think one of the ways in which you guys lose to the opening government, however, or lose, I guess, lose to the opening government, is both opposition teams were kind of challenged about what to do with the counterfactual. Like, the counterfactual is a world wherein, like, these people are dying. The whip in a POI does provide an answer, where you're like, look, it's not our burden to provide a counter model. We don't really know what to do. We know that this one is bad. However, in this case, I think because, like, there is a real counterfactual by which the panel can evaluate what's going on in the round, there needs to be something. Like, I'm not punishing you for not saying this, but I think an easy one is just like open borders, right? Just like countries that have space and want to bid for refugees can do so. Like, we think all countries should open their borders. We think there should be more open borders, whatever. Like,
would that have been like in or
not necessarily, but I think that like not necessarily, but the impression the panel was left with is that you didn't know how to handle that counterfactual, and so your response was kind of like a, we don't know, so we're not going to touch it, rather than like a, here's a few ideas that might work. Right? And so I think that you're challenged, all up and down the bench, you guys are challenged to deal with this counterfactual, because at the end of the day, like, both opposition teams do a really good job of mitigating the efficacy and mitigating the persuasiveness of their arguments and then the effectiveness of their model. But Cam is repeatedly like, look, like, they might, like, being discriminated against or suffering kind of these injustices in this new country or in this new land is a hell of a lot better than being a beggar on the street, was the example we get from the closing, or being dead at the bottom of the ocean, right? So I think that, in principle, if everyone in the debate agrees that these people will be displaced, because no one really challenged that in opposition. No one really said that, like, this is climate alarmism, there aren't going to be these, like, billions of refugees that are all over the place. No one can test that. Everyone in this debate agreed that there will be a sizable number of people displaced by global climate change. At the minute everyone in this debate agrees about that, and you're going to say their model doesn't work, and then they're challenging you to say, you agree that this is going to be a refugee crisis. What's, like, if this is the, you know, it's if this is the worst option, but it's better than all the others, I'm not really sure what to do about it. So that's kind of one of the reasons that you guys slipped. So moving back to the opening government, we thought that the model was complicated but fine, like no real problems there. It got critiqued, but that's what happens in debate. We thought that you guys did a really good job of kind of the principled and the practical consequences. We really liked the idea of kind of like a simple but persuasive idea of what restitution means. That, like, we can't recompense you with money, we can't recompense you by rebuilding your country. Land for land is the best kind of form of recompense. I don't really have any criticisms because you guys were first in the round and there were things that I wish you could have addressed but you couldn't because you were done speaking. I guess the only thing that maybe I would have liked to have seen is perhaps a bit more kind of justification on why like a strict liability standard, as it were, it should be imposed. I think you guys answered it kind of through POIs and then it was dealt with in the whip. But you can't predict what the extension is going to be, you can't predict what the opposition is going to be, but we did find the arguments coming from the member of the opposition quite good. So that's how we saw the round. If you have any specific questions, feel free to talk to me.